Welcome to the Noon at Northside podcast with your host, Pastor Stephanie. Well, welcome back, everyone. I really hope you guys were able to join us the last couple of months. We've been talking about some really amazing topics so far. And I'm really excited about, what we've been saying, what we've been talking about, and even where we're able to go from here. Last month, we had a great guest speaker, Carla Baker, who was here, and I was just so excited to have her with me as we talked about, looking back over our history and, crossing the bridge between the different generations when it comes to our history and what that means for us. Because I've worked a lot with Carla, so to have her there with me and to have her, bring her perspective, it was pretty awesome. I really hope you got something out of it just as much as I did. Well, this is the start of a new month, which means it's the start of a new topic with a whole new guest speaker coming in 2 weeks. And this is one of those topics that I am super jazzed about. Not because, the topic is super awesome. It's actually pretty sad, the topic. Sounds a little weird, but it's one that I feel very passionate about. It's a topic that while I was at Olivet Nazarene University getting both my undergrad and my graduate degrees, it was one that I really was drawn to. I focused a lot of my research, a lot of my elective courses, a lot of my time understanding, what it was that was connecting, our faith and today's topic, which is on trauma. Now, that sounds like a really big kind of word to listen to. Like, some of you probably heard me say trauma and you're like, oh, I don't think I want to listen to this. But hear me out. Today's topic, it's not so much the revealing all of our trauma, because we all have trauma and it's all horrible and it's all hard to deal with. But a lot of times when we look at this gap in the church between younger generations and older generations, which is the whole point of the topics that we cover on this podcast, is that trauma is something that everyone deals with, no matter how old you are or young you are. We all face trauma and we all have to deal with its nasty side effects. And yet it is one of those things that different generations, they have a big divide between them over this topic of trauma and mental health and spiritual health, because we don't always take the time to understand another person's perspective on their trauma. We all have our own trauma to deal with, and a lot of us, myself included, tend to, because we're so focused on our own trauma and the things that we've been through, that we forget that it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the same for someone else. It doesn't necessarily mean that their trauma is any less, any greater, or any more important. We tend to project our own trauma and problems and side effects and dealings onto other people without actually stopping to look at their trauma from their perspective, or even just the topic of trauma in general. So today we're talking about trauma so that we can maybe get a better understanding of how trauma works in our bodies and in our minds and in our spirits, so that when we're actually going towards the goal of bridging this gap in the church today, we might actually stop and consider this might have a large thing to say about it. This might be a topic that if we actually stopped and considered it when it came to other people of other generations, that we might actually be able to help bridge the gap a lot easier. So we're talking about trauma, and let me just start off by saying trauma is a very generic term. Yet we treat it as if it is very specific. A lot of people have a hard time, learning to take trauma from other people's perspectives and to understand how everyone else deals with trauma, because we think we know what it means. We think when we hear the word trauma, we're like, I understand, I know what you've been through, I know what you're going through, I know how you're dealing with it. And in all honesty, we really don't. This divide between different generations, between different people, regardless of age or sex or gender or experiences, or regardless of what it is that divides two types of people, trauma is one of those things where we think we know what it means. And so we think we know what the other person is dealing with, and we really don't. Trauma, we tend, and a lot of people do, deal with trauma in a way that they think there's levels to it. A lot of times when you hear someone has been through something traumatic, you start categorizing it, saying, depending on what you say, I can categorize this as a high degree of trauma or a low degree of trauma. And we as humans, who are human beings, who have a human sinful nature, and our go-to perspective is, this idea of a sinful nature, is we hear what someone's been through and we think, depending on the level of their trauma, is what's going to determine the amount of respect and the amount of compassion that I give to that person. Let me explain that a little bit. So there are a lot of people who, when they hear someone has been in a war or been in a huge kind of accident, like a car crash or something, or who has been raped or something of that nature, automatically they think, okay, this person deserves my highest degree of respect and compassion and understanding and support for what they've been through. You see or you hear those that they've been through something on that level, and you automatically are willing to do whatever it takes to understand and support them, which is amazing, which is fantastic. The thing where we get a little bit of a divide between us is the people who have been through something traumatic that we don't always think is quote unquote worthy enough of the same thing as someone who's been to war or who has been raped. And the problem with that is in our brains, when we're going to take a little bit of a biology lesson here, in our brains, the way our brains deal with trauma is this thing called a stress response. That fight, flight, freeze response that we've probably all heard. It's a very primitive response in the human brain because it's designed to keep us alive in the moment something traumatic is happening. So in the split second when we're about to get run over by a car, or the split second when we're facing a wild animal that could possibly maul us to death, it's designed to help us deal with, do I fight it? Do I run from it? What do I do? And to help save our lives. And in those moments, it's fantastic. But in moments when we're remembering those traumatic events or we're recalling something, that primitive response reacts in the same way, which is where we get things like PTSD from, post-traumatic stress. We are reliving traumatic events because we're remembering that traumatic event. Not that we're living in something that's instantaneous, high stress, high trauma. We're simply remembering, we're recalling it. And that primitive response in our bodies reacts the same to both of them. And what that means is that there is no level of trauma that is higher or lower to the human body. Regardless of what type of trauma a person has been through, our bodies react the exact same way. Our bodies will deal with the same stress response, will recall the memory in the exact same way, and will provide the same mental and physical side effects regardless of what it is we've been through. There's a reason, I titled this podcast Equality in Trauma, because one of the things that divides us across generations, across male and female, across whatever, the thing that divides us is that we think there is a level to trauma, and that there are certain types of trauma that people have gone through that I am fully supportive of, that I'm fully committed to loving and caring for that person and just giving them compassion. And then there are other types of trauma where when we see someone dealing with the exact same side effects, our response to them is, you have no reason to feel that way. Or we respond to, just get over it, just brush it off, just get up and move on from it. Stop focusing on it. Stop reliving it. I don't want to hear it anymore. You're constantly talking about this, blah, 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 whatever. We divide who gets our support and compassion for trauma, when in all actuality, it's the exact same symptoms. Regardless of what you've been through, our bodies deal with it the exact same way. And that means as a human being who's seen another person who's had something traumatic happen, our response to them should be to bridge this gap, always showing respect, giving compassion, offering them support and love. Because there really is trauma really is one of those things that puts us all on an equal playing field. There is nothing that we can go through that is a different degree of trauma. We all deal with it in the same ways. Now, yes, there are different, biological connections. There are different ways people cope with things. Some people, like myself, watch a lot of TV to cope with trauma. Some people cope with trauma with drugs or alcohol. Some people get aggressive, and some people lock themselves away. We all have different coping strategies, but they're all symptoms of the same response, that primitive stress response. And no matter what degree of trauma we've been through, we all have those same primitive responses. So let me just kind of break this down for us. The problem with a lot of PTSD that people don't quite realize is that it creates this trench in our minds. It causes such a deep pain and a response in the human brain that regardless of what we've been through, like I've been saying, we kind of have to deal with it the same way. It repeats itself over and over again. We remember the event and have to relive it. We recall something similar to our trauma, and again, we relive it. Our brains activate the same stress response over and over and over again, regardless of whether we've gone through something huge or gone through something we would consider not so huge. Some people, to be honest, deal with trauma and they don't even know what it is that traumatized them. Some people have something very traumatic happen to them at childhood. We call these, childhood adversities. And, or another way of putting them is adverse childhood experiences, ACE. A lot of people don't even remember what it is that happened to them, but their bodies react to that trauma as if it happened yesterday, as if their body is fully understanding of what happened to them. So regardless of whether they can tell you, oh, I was in a car crash, oh, I went to war, they're dealing with trauma just the same. Trauma, by definition, is something that is unbearable and intolerable, no matter what caused it. And if we start thinking of trauma like that, then we can start bridging the gaps we have and that we make with people by just understanding that all people, no matter who they are, what they've been through, all people deserve our respect, our compassion, and our support for what they are going through. And if we take the time to stop what we're doing, what we're thinking, what we're saying, and thinking, okay, look at how they're experiencing something. Do I recognize the side effects? Is this aggression a side effect of some trauma? Is this hiding away that they're doing, again, some kind of stress that they're under? Is what they're doing something that they can't control because it is a side effect of trauma? And if we go with that as the baseline, the equal playing field for all people, then we can change how we interact with other people. It's very simple just to say, change how we respond to all people and show all people love and support, regardless of what they've been through. One of the things we recently did here at Northside was we were offered what's called TBRI training for anyone who was volunteering here at Elkhart Northside with any of our kids or our teenagers. And we partnered with a man who has started an organization in South Bend, Indiana, called Village to Village. And he came and talked to us about what's called TBRI, which is a training about trust-based relations interventions. And it's a way of training people who work with kids, have kids, or even just are around kids frequently, how to deal with just kids who maybe have certain trauma-related trust issues, intimacy issues, a disconnect from people and reality, a disconnect between their brain and their body, which, when you really think about it, you could apply to kids and adults in general, because you never know who's faced trauma. You never know who has faced something that their bodies can't react appropriately to, that their bodies force them to be out of control about. And so dealing and learning how to, interact with people who might have some kind of trauma or trust issues on just a general playing field is an awesome way of, bridging this gap. And one of the things we learned at this specific training that we did was that a lot of times when we're dealing, and yes, this is specific to kids, but when we're dealing with other people and kids, we tend to have a real negative perspective on what other people are doing. We see the actions that they're taking, if they're negative actions like taking drugs, drinking alcohol, being very aggressive, and we automatically think, oh, that's their choice. They must be the bad guy here. And what we learned in this TBRI training was that it's not, how we deal with people is not about, supporting what they do. It is not about taking their side. It's not about rewarding bad behaviors. It is about showing love and support to help somebody regulate their disconnect. A lot of the times, and I'm not saying all the time, because there are some exceptions, but most of the time, the people who are showing those signs of negative and bad behaviors towards other people or towards themselves are only doing it because there is something disconnected between their brains and their bodies. They're doing something they have no control over. They're doing something and they don't even realize they're doing it. And we have a responsibility as Christians, as people who are living Christ-like lives, to show them love regardless of the negative behaviors that they are portraying. Because it's not about punishing the behavior. It's about loving the person and showing them support. which brings us back to this equality in trauma. It's something that very easily can bridge the gap between people because it automatically puts us all in the same playing field. It automatically brings us closer together if we, as human beings, just open our eyes and look at the perspective of another person instead of just ourselves. Not saying that all people do that. I mean, I'm not saying that everyone does this. There are a lot of people who are very good at just automatically showing love and support. But this is something that a lot of people do struggle with, is seeing the need behind the behavior instead of just the behavior. A lot of people look at what someone's doing, what someone's going through, and automatically assume that this is something bad. And so they respond with, knock it off, get over it, grow up, kind of an idea. When in fact, we should just be saying to ourselves, there has to be a real, legit reason for what they're doing. It may be if I look at their situation from their perspective, I'll get a better idea of it. And when we're talking about bridging the gap between generations, between male and female, between different types of people, regardless of what that disconnect is, the main way to bridge that gap is to start by looking at the other person's perspective. It's as simple as that, as looking at the other person's perspective and saying, I think I know what I need to do to change, to get closer. Because we can't change other people. And so we can't bridge the gap between ourselves and other people if we are expecting them to do all the work to come closer to me. We have to be the ones to move because we're the only people that we can change. You're the only person you have control over. And so if we're going to bridge the gap, it starts with ourselves. It starts with asking ourselves, what can we do differently to change this gap, to bridge this gap? Trauma fundamentally changes who we are, and we don't even realize it. It changes the chemistry of our brains. It changes the patterns of our brains. It can literally change our ability, our capacity to think and act. And our bodies respond accordingly. Our bodies do things, and our brains have no idea why it's doing it. There's a reason panic attacks mimic the exact same symptoms as a heart attack. Because there is a bodily component to mental health and mental trauma. And so if we stop to consider that there might be some kind of mental reasoning to something, we automatically take a step closer to bridging that gap. And we also automatically take a step closer in figuring out the issue, the core to something, and then appropriately responding the best spiritual guidance that we can give to someone. Because unless we know what someone needs from us, we can never give it to them. And so to be honest, we can sit and pray for someone every day, all day long, every day. But unless we know what to pray over, I don't know if we can be as much help. Yes, God has complete control over situations. But there's a lot of times that God's answers to prayer is putting the right people in their lives. And he gives us the gifts and ability to be the answer to prayer that they're looking for. So if we know that the need behind someone's actions, I believe truly that it is a better prayer to help the right person and the right thing enter that person's life, to get them what they truly need to be better versions of themselves and to be better versions of their Christ lives. Well, that's all I've got for you guys today. I really do hope that something I said, impacted you, that something I said was, new and informative for you. I want to put this out there. If there's anything confusing about maybe something that I've said, please drop a comment on our Facebook page, Noon at Northside, because I want to be the type of person that's able to help you. Sometimes I get tripped over my words. I'm human. There are some times that I say something and someone's like, that was a little confusing. Could you have unpacked that a little bit more? Yes, I could have, probably. But I want to see your guys' comments. If you have questions, if you have concerns, if you have a comment at all, I want to see your interaction with this so that this isn't just my perspective dropping onto you. I want to see what your guys' thoughts are. So please drop a comment at the end of this on Facebook, and we go from there, okay? So thank you guys for tuning in this week. I really hope you guys got something out of it. Stay tuned for 2 weeks from now when we're going to have a guest speaker come and add to this topic. Our guest speaker is actually going to be bringing a very unique perspective to this idea of equality and trauma. This person has dealt a lot with working with foster kids, and especially them being a foster parent themselves. And when we talk about trauma, although there is no, degree of trauma, we are all in the same equal playing field. I have to admit, foster kids, or even adults who at one point were in the foster system, they're more than likely dealing with trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. And that brings about a lot more complications with it. And so it's a very unique perspective to hear from somebody who has worked with these people, who has lived with these people, and who can bring a unique perspective on how we can bridge the gap between people by learning how to bridge the gap between us and these foster kids. So I really, really hope you guys stay tuned for the second half of this month's conversation when we have our guest speaker coming and talking to you guys about their perspective with foster kids and their trauma. So like I said, thank you guys for tuning in. I'll catch you guys next time.